8:55. We'll see. I'm going to see what I'm going to see. Let's keep it at 8:45 for the minute. I'm going to see how the traffic goes.
You feel like you need an hour and 15? Can you talk faster?
No.
I said to Tanya, maybe, you know how on the phone you do 2, 1.5? I said, if Tanya does like 1.5 for 2, then we could do it in an hour from 9 to 10. No. So we're leaving it at 8:45.
For the minute, we'll see. Yeah. What was that? Because I feel like an hour isn't necessarily enough, but we could do it. Well, we may move it to 9:50. But we'll see. As in, instead of 9:45. Sorry, not 9:50. 8:50. 5 minutes more, you get in bed. 5 minutes more. We'll see. We'll see. Anyway, it's amazing to be back. Last year, when we came back, I said that the year before, I had imagined in my head that we would kind of come back and the Chatufim would be home and the war would be over. That was a year ago, a year after it had started. And even though we are waiting still for the Halalim to come back, the live hostages are home. The war is ostensibly, at least, over. And I feel that the class that we've had over the last year, and we're going to continue to have, is a class that has been grappling very much with the idea of adversity, resilience, how we navigate the space of the world that isn't offering us exactly what we would expect it to offer us. And this year I've called the class something slightly different. I've called the class the work of becoming, Jewish resilience through the biblical narrative. Now, those of you that have been with me, I can see there are some new faces. I know that there's plenty of you that have been with me over the last year and many, many years before that. You'll know that one of the things we did in this class was to bring music into the class, contemporary Israeli music into the class. And I try to do it at least, once every 2 weeks. We're going to be doing something similar, but not as often. And the reason why I still want to do this is because, and I'm going to begin with this, and I say this very often, but I want to say it again. There are many people sitting in this room and on Zoom who have experienced a total rupture in their lives, some of them not related to the war, some of them very much related to the war. And one of the dangers of a teacher standing in front of a class and giving over messages about Jewish text, about Jewish philosophy, about Jewish thinking that's related to the moment that we're in is the danger of betrayal. Because I always say that words are order, and order presumes the way in which we speak, language, words, speech, is the objective universalizing of my subjective experience. So what's going on inside of me, I use words in order to create order. Now, when God creates the world, he creates the world and he speaks as he's creating, and he's creating order from tohu vavohu, from chaos, okay? One of the divine, I would say, kind of characteristics that we're given as human beings is to be godlike, and that is to be able to use language. Language differentiates us from animals. We are the only species that can speak in the way that we do, and therefore that's a godlike, a divine characteristic. And in that divine characteristic is the ability to communicate between ourselves. Now, what we see in this week's Parshat Noach, is the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel, we're not going to get into it today, but the Tower of Babel is the perfect example of the way in which language can be abused. Okay, the way in which language, which is meant to create order, which is meant to create a relationship between human beings in order for them to be productive, in order for them to dignify, in order for them to create relationships, okay, and to make the world a better place, what language can often do is the opposite. Language, instead of, you know, working towards the divine mission, will often do the opposite. Language is a way in which we literally, according to the rabbis, can kill somebody else. Now, obviously not in a literal way, in a metaphorical way, but to say the death, that's exactly death. Death can be done through language. Language is a tool that can create order and can create chaos. Language is a tool in which we can dignify, but it's also a tool in which we can really make someone feel as though they have died, okay? Language is a tool in which we can express something that is inexpressible, but it's also a tool in which we can betray the experiences of our fellow beings and even of ourselves. And so one of the introductions I want to give to this course is as follows. There is no way for me to know what all of you have experienced over the last 2 years and what all of you have experienced in a lifetime. And much of what we're going to be speaking about in this course, however much it is a Torah course and however much it's a course of Jewish philosophy and however much it's a kind of a course at Matan that I'm taking, it's also a course about life. Because my philosophy is that if Torah doesn't speak to us in our moment, in our lives, in the realness of our, and the complexity and messiness of our living, it doesn't speak to us at all. Torat Chaim, that's what the rabbis say. It's a living, breathing, dynamic Torah. And so one of the dangers of this course is that I will betray your experience of life, your experience of adversity, your experience of the way in which you've navigated your story, your personal story, or your national story. And so I begin already by saying, if that is the case, and if that happens, please come and speak to me or message me. You don't have to do it in front of the whole class. In fact, maybe better not to, okay? But speak to me and tell me, you know what, that wasn't what you said, didn't speak to me in this way. And on the opposite side, if it does, I'm also happy to hear. Okay, so that's first thing. I want to now go to the course itself. This course was born in war. It was born as a product of the war. It started last year, and it related to a lot of the work that I've been doing with biblical narratives over the last decade, which is very much kind of mining the biblical narratives for their relevance to our lived life, which in my mind is constantly navigating the space between what the world gives us and what we believe the world ought to give us. That space, that gap, which we're going to talk about as we go on. Many of you who have been with me over the years know about that gap because I speak about it very often. That gap between the world as it is and the world as we want it to be, okay? That gap is where many of us, most of us live. And that gap, by the way, is where most of us fall, where most of us face adversity. And so one of the things I wanted to do in this course, because as a whole and as a nation, we were constantly coming face to face with that reality, was to really try and mine the biblical text for their relevance. And we began this course last year, but the truth is that, God willing, this year the course is going to be taught in a time of peace. Please God. And the basis, the foundation of it is actually neither about war or peace, okay? It's related, but it's not the fundamental element and core element of the course, okay? As I said, it's about what does it mean to be a human in an imperfect world, okay? And what is our orientation to that gap, to that space, to that world? And I think very much that our tradition, our legacy, our Torah, has the tools for us to help us. Again, it will not provide us with perfect answers because there are no perfect answers, but it has the tools to help us navigate where that space. It has the tools to help us to orient ourselves in a certain posture towards the world around us. And I think that it was those tools that allowed all of those hostages that we have been speaking about and that we have seen and that we have witnessed, to find what I'm going to talk about today, which is the idea of tikva, to find hope, but not hope in the classic sense. I'm going to talk about what it means to have tikva. Okay, if we think about Agam Belga and how she managed to find when Shabbat was and when Pesach was, and created that space of freedom in the dungeons, in the tunnels, to hold it. If we think about Eli Sharabi and how he connected with his Jewish tradition, if we think about Gadi Moses and how he walked about a meter room in order to keep fit so he could return to his kibbutz, if we think about every single hostage that's come out, I don't know if people saw most amazing video on Sukkot of Omer Shem Tov speaking about how he spoke to God every single day. If you think about all of the hostages that we spoke about, one in particular that was very close to my heart, Bar Kupishtin, whose mother Julie I met mamash in the first 2 months of the war. No one even knew his name because there were so many hundreds of hostages at the time. And I had a very, very long conversation with her in Kikar Hatufim, and she told me the whole story about how the father had been injured a few years before, and Bar became the main provider of the house. And I was totally taken aback by her and her faith. And from then onwards, I kind of adopted Bar as my kind of chatuf. And if you listen to him and you listen to what he says and you see what the stories about how he always he made himself useful. He found ways of connecting the radio they'd given them to listen to the davening of the Arabs. He managed to connect it to find the channels, and then the other Chatufim could hear Galgalatz, and how he managed always wherever he was put to find electricity points so that they would have some form of light. There's something profoundly, and here I'm going to say profoundly Jewish, about the stories of these hostages and the way in which they navigated the impossible, unimaginable, inhumane circumstances in which they were in. And I want to speak about all of these things because what I want to do today and next week, as by way of introduction to the course, is to ask the question of what does it mean to have tikva? What does tikva, hope, mean? And I actually want to speak about it also from the philosophical, theological, psychological perspective of as human beings. But I want to specifically talk about it from the theological perspective of what is tikva in Judaism, right? What does tikva mean for us as Jews? But I also want to relate it to hermeneutics. What is hermeneutics? Big words. What is it? Study of language, of words, okay? It's the way in which we study texts, okay? And I want to suggest that not only is tikva a very specific theological notion related specifically to Judaism and the Bible. I'm going to show you where I see it in the Bible, in the Torah, in the Tanakh. But tikva is also our hermeneutical tool. It's the way in which we access our Jewish texts. Okay, now this might sound a bit far-fetched. Sometimes things with me are far-fetched, but I really don't think it is, because, and here I'm just gonna very briefly tell you kind of what my thesis, what my argument is in the next 2 weeks, is that we are one of the, there's very, very few religious traditions that possess two texts, an oral text and a written text. And there's something about the oral text of Judaism, in my mind, that makes it a hermeneutical tradition of hope, which means that when we come to the text, we are coming to the text in the hope, right, of finding something that wasn't there before. And we are engaged in an active posture of and I would say, we are engaged in an interpretive gesture vis-a-vis the text, meaning we're not just looking at the text as a fixed, it's very hot in here, Oshua, maybe it's just me. I'm like dying. It's not just that we address the text and that we say the text is a fixed text, it has its authorship, the authority of the author, and we cannot touch the text, okay? It has We have to keep it as it is 100%. That is true of the written law, but the oral law invites us into the text as a partner in the text, and it draws us into the text and says, you need to look at that text with fresh eyes. You need to be an interpretive partner, or you need to be a partner in the interpretive act of the text. And I want to suggest that that invitation rests, okay, on the idea of tikva, because it essentially says to us, and we're gonna follow this all through, and I'm gonna build it all up for you, but I just want to like lay out the foundations to begin with, because it says to you, I believe in the power of your interpretive agency. I believe, says God to human beings, that you have the ability to take my text and make it speak to you in this moment. What is that? What does that mean? It means that God tells us that we are incredibly capable humans, that we have a role to play in this world. I was just listening to an incredible podcast on the way here in Hebrew. It's called Kashe La'amin with Efrat Shapiro Rosenberg. She interviews it's a series of, I think, eight different interviews, and the basis of the podcast is about the idea of rupture after October the 7th. And she interviews 7 or 8 different people for whom the 7th of October was a massive rupture. Now, not just people who lost people, but people like, for example, the head of the Eshkol region, who before this was helping Gazans come and work in Israel. And he truly, truly believed that that was the way in order to make peace, that was the way we were going to believe. And his entire philosophy was totally ruptured. And now he's gone to like a 180-degree turn to a totally different way of understanding. So not just people who have lost people, but also ruptured. And one of the people she just spoke to when I was listening to was a psychologist who has been treating thousands and thousands of trauma victims, both soldiers, people from the Nova, people from the southern region, many, many, many different people. She's like one of the top people that are dealing with the situation. And she spoke about exactly, it was crazy, literally as I was driving here, she was speaking exactly about the idea of tikva. And she said that she gave the example of, I think it was in Near Oz, that there was a family, a mother, quite a few examples of mothers who were comforting their children in the mamadim. And they kept saying to them, the army's on its way, you know, everything's going to be okay. The army's on its way, everything's going to be okay. Until they realize the army's not on its way and things are not going to be okay. And she can't promise her children that anymore. And they heard the terrorists in the house. And they said, the mother said at that moment, they had to change, and they said to their children, I am with you. I am always your mother, no matter what. You are loved. No matter what, I am with you. I'm holding you. I'm with you till the end. And there was that sudden like transformation they had to make. But what remained in almost all the cases was there was an arena, a very small arena, where they held on to their capability of interpreting the reality. How can I interpret this reality for my children? And we know from Viktor Frankl as well, that where people made themselves necessary, where they found a very small arena to make myself necessary, to take agency, that's where hope was cultivated, even in the most adverse situations. So what I want to go back to hermeneutics. I believe that one of the things that kept us alive as a nation through 2,000 years of galut was the oral law, because there was one arena in which we could have been oppressed from the outside, and we could have been 100%, not had freedom in any other arena of our political life, national life, personal lives. There was one arena in which we still retained agency, and that was in our role as the interpreters of the law, of the Torah. of our text. And so for me, not only are we going to dig down deep into the idea of tikva from a more theological, psychological perspective, but I also want to look at it from a hermeneutical perspective. What does it mean to read the Torah through the prism of hope? So that's going to be what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks. And I want to begin with why I called this course the work of becoming. Okay, why did I call it the work of becoming, and how is it related to Jewish resilience in the biblical narrative? And I want to begin with the pasuk, which speaks about becoming, and that is the pasuk that God says, the verse that God relays to Moshe, when Moshe says to him, what should I say when they ask me, what is your name? And by the way, okay, let's begin with that. Okay, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? How shall I define you, says Moshe. Why is Moshe so obsessed with definitions? Very clearly because in the ancient world, everything was about definitions. Everything was about, I am the God whose arena is the sun or the sky, and I'm the God whose arena is the ground, or I'm the God and whose arena is, and everything was about the definitions of arena of what area does your God rule over. And so Moshe says to God, I want to know how to define you. You are the God of what? You are the God of which arena? What box do we put you into? And what is God's response? God's response is a massively radical and new paradigm. He says, Eheyeh asher eheyeh. He doesn't speak about the here and the now. He doesn't speak about tangible arenas of influence. He speaks about a theological, and I would even say psychological, definition of being, and that is the definition of being as becoming. Now, why is this such a massive, so what does Eheyeh asher eheyeh mean? So in old translations, in non-Jewish translations, it translated very often as I am what I am. That's how, yeah, we know that it isn't, right? But that's how it was. I am what I am. But in Jewish translations, the real translation is, I will be, in a future tense, I will be what I will be. Now, why is that such a massive theological shift? Because essentially what God is saying is that I cannot be defined. I am a God that sits outside of human definition. Remember, we spoke about the idea of words as order. Words are the way in which we manifest order in a tohu, in a world of tahom, of disorder, and of how do you translate tahom? Like a void, right? And God is saying, yes, one element of God is to bring order for human beings into the world, but know that ultimately God defies all of that order. God is in the tahom. God is in the void. God is the void. God is being. He is constantly moving with us as human beings. There's this constant dynamic. And I think even more than that, when God says to humans, be like me, right? We know that there's this idea of humans being in the image of God. We are in the image of God because as human beings, we can be what we can be, meaning nothing is set in stone. Remember, we're told in that famous midrash that before the world was created, one of the things that was created before the world was teshuvah, was the ability of repentance. Horrible translation. Okay, teshuvah is the ability to change myself, but not just myself, to change the past, to change the present, and to change the future. Why was this such a theological shift? Because ultimately, human beings were seen as pawns in the wills of the gods, in the fates of the god. The gods were the ones that moved the human beings on earth and told them, manipulated them, and told them what to do. And we were at the will and the beck and call of the gods. The Bible comes, the Torah comes and says, no, human beings are free. Human beings are like God in their ability to become And I want to read with you Eliezer Berkovitz. And fascinatingly enough, Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, who was a very, very well-known, one of the most well-known theologians in the 20th century, he began in America. He learned under Rav Soloveitchik from Yeshiva University. He then moved to Israel and became a lecturer in Hebrew University. And some of his, many of his writings were transformative for modern Judaism, for the Judaism that we live in and practice today. And one of the things he writes in his book, Faith After the Holocaust, and he's a very, very well-known Holocaust theologian, and he speaks here about the idea of being, but he speaks about it related to the idea of Kedusha and Tahara, between the idea of the mundane and the sacred. And he says, the major difference between the Jewish and Christian positions with reference to our subject lies in their differing concepts of the sacred. Within Judaism, the sacred and the profane are not dialectically related. One might say, I'll explain it in a second, okay? One might say that within Judaism, the sacred, insofar as it may be a human concern at all, is not found in the realm of being, but in the realm of becoming. Meaning what? Meaning if I have an object, let's say for argument's sake, I have an apple in front of me, or I have wine in front of me, or I have candles in front of me, or I have a human being in front of me, or I have a moment of time in front of me, okay? That object is an object that is, which means it's being, okay? It can be inanimable, or it can be also something that isn't living, but it doesn't matter, okay? It is being. It is an object that is being. Judaism says to me that that object doesn't have in and of itself any inherent sanctity until it's been acted upon. And who acts upon that object to give it sanctity? We do. So we move that object from being to becoming sacred. And this, says Eliezer Berkovitz, Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, this, he says, is the secret of Judaism. The secret of Judaism is that we have the ability to change the component features of objects. And if we have the ability to change the component features of objects, how much more so we have the ability to change our reality, to change ourselves, to change the world. And so he says, the sacred is not, it must be brought into being through human action and behavior. The seventh day is not holy in itself, but becomes holy when God sanctifies it. And I have to tell you, when I read these things now, and I think of what the Chatufim did in the most adverse of situations, how they were able to sanctify things. That was their tikva. That was how they acted out the Jewish notion of hope in the most adversarial of situations. It's quintessentially Jewish, okay? Israel is made holy by God and becomes holy through the act of self-sanctification. When I make a bracha on the apple, what am I doing? I am investing in the apple an element of sacredness. When I make kiddush over the wine, when I light Shabbat candles, when I carve out a moment in time and make it holy, I am doing the sacred act of moving from being to becoming. And in that act I am saying three theological statements. I am saying, number one, mankind is free. Number two, mankind is responsible, because my freedom calls me to responsibility vis-a-vis the world around me. And number three, I am in partnership, in covenant with God, with a transcendent being. And when I make those three theological statements, I am also making a psychological statement about myself. And that psychological statement is that despite every single thing that happens to me, whether by my choosing or not by my choosing, and this is very Viktor Frankl, but I would say Viktor Frankl gets this from Judaism, right? He mined Judaism for its wisdom, is that despite whatever happens to me from the outside, there is always a component part, or there is always an elemental part of my being that can carve out an arena of freedom where I can move from a being to a becoming. Okay, and so he says, you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Is not a divine promise or an otherworldly transfiguration or redemption, but a challenge to Israel, meaning Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh isn't a statement of what is. It is a statement of what can become, okay? A task, a responsibility. Humanity is called upon to sanctify itself, to sanctify the earthly Adam within the world. Kedusha, holiness, is sanctification. And sanctification is a process in time, not a miracle outside of time. One is called upon to sanctify one's earthly life. And that is why I decided to call the course the work of becoming, because I believe that this idea of becoming isn't just like a new kind of keyword in psychological discourse today. Okay, you hear a lot. There's even a Christina Teppet, I think her name is. She's like a very, very well-known podcaster, and she has a podcast called Becoming. Okay, it's become a word that's like become like a buzzword. That's what I'm thinking of. Thank you. It's become my students who already get into my brain and know what I'm going to say. Becomes like a buzzword, right? Has become a buzzword today, but I want to suggest that it actually stands at the heart of our ancient text, of our ancient theological project, that is Judaism. And that is the idea that we have been mandated to become, to be beings that transform into becomings, okay? And where does that happen? And I believe, and unfortunately, and it really is unfortunately, it so often happens when we are faced with the gap between the world that is and the world that we believe should be, okay? Because in that space, that's when all those layers and all those illusions that we have as human beings are suddenly ripped away from us, and we stand as we are. I keep thinking back to what Omer Shem Tov said, and if you haven't watched it, I really, again, we don't have a group at the moment of this class, but I'll put it on the group from last year. As soon as they make a group, I can send all of these things onto the group, where he turns around and he says that one of the things he misses, and it sounds very much like it echoes Natan Sharansky in his book, one of the things he misses, he says, there's obviously nothing I miss about being imprisoned in Gaza, but one of the things that is lacking for me is the clarity with which I was able to hear God and to speak to him. And I think that we're going to talk a lot about this year, specifically when we look at the women of the Exodus. That actually there should be sheets with the outline of, I don't know if they've got, oh, you've got them. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a minute. When we talk about the women of the Exodus, we're going to talk about this idea of why or how we hear God in this world. Okay, and what does it mean to hear God in this world, and why is it important for our topic, which is resilience and adversity? But I really believe that that ability to recognize that we don't have to just be what we are. We can be what we will be. And what we will be, that's the becoming. When we move the world from the mundane to the sacred, that is the act of becoming, okay? And that act of becoming, more often than not, happens when those layers are removed from us. And those layers being removed for us very often happens in that gap, where we walk into the gap of what I will call kind of breakage, rupture. And with that, I want to move to David Weiss Halivni. Those of you that were with me last year will remember this source, or not remember, as the case may be, this source from the first class last year. It's an incredibly important source. Again, David Weiss Halivni went through the Holocaust, spoke about the Holocaust. He's a very well-known Jewish theologian, and he wrote a book called Broken and Repaired, where he speaks about how the Holocaust relates to the Torah text. You know, how does rupture relate to the Torah text? And I want to read with you what he says, because I think it is so prescient to this moment of ours and specifically to this course. He says to read from the plain sense first is to do in a time of relative peace. That's a time when we have no reason to doubt our usual habits of life and study, meaning when we read the text and we just look at the text on its one-dimensional plain meaning, we can do that when we're in a time of peace, where everything's going our way, where everything seems good, where everything seems right, okay? In such a time, we trust our eyes to teach us what is happening in the world and our ears to deliver age-old teachings about what we ought to do in the world. We peer behind the plain sense only when things remain unclear on the surface. And in times of peace, we have only modest needs to peer behind in this way. And I'm going to stop here for a minute. We've already moved now to the hermeneutical project of how do we read a text and the difference between reading a text in times of war and times of peace. But I want to just go back for a minute and talk about it from the human perspective. When things go well and when things are peaceful and when things are good and when the status quo is at an equilibrium, we don't tend to like go behind the one-dimensional elements of our existence. Like we don't, again, goes back to everything we've been seeing, this renaissance of spirit, of spiritual awakening that we've been seeing since October the 7th. Because when things are okay, there's no need to go beyond the superficiality of our existence, okay? When things are not, that's when we begin to ask questions. That's when we begin to seek. That's when we begin to open our eyes up to something that might exist, to dimensions of our existence that don't always come at first impression. And so he says the same with the Jewish text, because the text is at the heart of our existence, at the heart of us as a people. In peacetime, we might just read the text as it is and say, oh, we'll cling on to old interpretations because we don't need new interpretations there, because the old interpretations work, or the old interpretations are enough. Says David Weiss Halivni, in times when we are challenged, that's when we need to go and dig down deeper. So he says like this, times without peace are times when social events are so disruptive that in at least some spheres of life, our customary ways of acting, believing, and even seeing no longer seem trustworthy. What once seemed natural or self-evident in its identity and meaning is no longer natural. There are times when we are therefore most likely to look for guidance far beneath the plain sense of things. To look for such guidance is first to acknowledge that what we once took to be nature was only the way the world looked in light of our presuppositions. That is, our habits, our assumptions and beliefs, all of which are imperfect and all of which can be refined. It is second to try to bring those presuppositions up to the light of the day, that we may judge which of them may no longer help us make sense of this newly disrupted world. It is third to try to revise these presuppositions so that they may more successfully prepare us to make sense of a changed world. This is the work of restoration. By the way, note that he doesn't say this is the work of revision. He says this is the work of restoration, and this is very important, meaning it's not to say we need new text, and it's not to say we need totally new interpretations. It's to say we need to restore some elements that may have been lost in the way, peripheral elements, peripheral interpretations that may have been lost on the way that we need to bring to the forefront. And by the way, one of the things I've written about before in the past, and I believe in very strongly, is that the way in which we answer the question of the problem of evil, which in the past very much leaned on the idea of divine reward and punishment, I believe needs also to be restored. And one of the books that we need to restore to a central place is the book of Eov, is the book of Job, and other paradigms that exist within our tradition. Again, what does that mean? It doesn't mean to say goodbye to everything. It means that there are certain, like we know that there, for example, when you learn Gemara, there's Breitot. Breitot are arguments that are brought that don't in the end lead to the law, but they're brought in because one time in the future we may need to restore those Breitot that will be relevant for a specific time and place in the future. And I believe that that's exactly what David Weiss Halivni is talking about here, that in times where there is rupture, we need to restore perhaps certain or central texts that had became peripheral and bring them back to the center. This is the work of restoration. Ideally is to repair maculated traditions, Masorah, and presuppositions so that the original sources, the plain sense of what God says and what the world is, may shine through. Short of the ideal, it is to pursue the plain sense nonetheless in the hope of drawing us much nearer to the truth, while we await a time of God's drawing nearer to us. So what he's saying is there's two levels of reading the text, one in the time of peace, and by the way, he doesn't even necessarily literally mean peace and war or peace and crisis. He means in times where, again, the order has been disrupted, whether it's on a personal level or on a national level. And in the time of peace, the plain sense is enough. In the time of crisis, we need to restore the text and look underneath at the different kind of levels of what the text might mean, okay? And by the way, that is exactly what the Rabbinic Project was, okay? The Rabbinic Project that happened after the destruction of the temple was exactly a restoration in the sense that it brought the text alive in a totally different way. We're going to talk about that as we go on in the course as well. I want to read one narrative that spoke to me Erev Simchat Torah, and I kept going back to it again and again and again, because we know it's a narrative that spoke to us in the early period of the state of Israel, when we saw the Holocaust survivors that came back to Israel, and we saw them literally being brought back to life, okay? And that is the prophecy of Yecheskel, of the dry bones. And I kept thinking about this when we were watching these images on Erev Simchat Torah. And I kept thinking all the time about what we have been thinking about the last 2 years, like about the hostages. Are they alive? Are they alive literally, and are they alive spiritually and psychologically? Like, there's no way 2 years under such terrible conditions. How can we? And all I kept thinking about is the screaming from the family. He's on his feet. He's on his feet, right? He's on his feet. He's on his feet. He's walking. He's on his feet. And all I kept thinking about was the prophecy, was the Nevuah of Yecheskel that spoke about bringing the people up to their feet, right? And I want to just read with you. And again, why am I bringing it here? I'm bringing it here because I think this is the perfect example of, number one, in a minute you'll see, the word tikva is here, okay? So it's related to what we're doing. But I also think it's a perfect example of the way in which the text comes alive for us in every different generation in different ways, and the way in which we can read the text to give us some form of meaning, of hope, of vision in each and every circumstance, each and every generation. So I want to just read with you the prophecy of Yecheskel. I'm going to read it in Hebrew, but I'm going to go to the English. I'm going to skip a bit in the middle, okay? Hayita alai yad Hashem v'yotzieni baruch Hashem v'yinchuni b'toch habik'ah v'hi mle'eh atzamot. Okay, so God speaks to me. He takes me out into this valley that's full of bones. V'havireni alehem saviv saviv v'hinei rabot me'od al pnei habik'ah v'hinei yeveshot me'od. And there were many. He took me around and around. There were many, and they were very, very dry. V'yomer elai ben adam hitchliana ahatzamot ha'eleh v'omer Hashem ata yadata. V'yomer elai hinaveh al hatzamot ha'eleh. Va'amarti alehem hatzamot hayevashot sham'u davar Hashem. And God called to him and says, I want you to prophesy on these bones. Ka amar Hashem la'atzamot ha'eleh. God says to these bones, Hinei ani mevi bachem ruach v'chayitem. And I think about this so much, this idea that God spoke to these bones and said to them, I am giving you the ruach. And again, I know people have listened to what the hostages have been saying, how they said that there was quite a few of them, but many of them, the same thing repeats itself again and again, that they felt, like they kept saying, we felt people's tefillot, we felt God, we felt a spirit, even in the darkest of places, we felt that something was there. And to me, when I kept going back to this nevuah of Hashem saying to the bones, I am giving you life. I am here with you. I am making you alive. ונתתי עליכם גידים, והעליתי עליכם בשר, וקמתי עליכם אור, ונתתי בכם רוח, וחייתם וידעתם כי אני אדוני. Right? I covered you with skin and with I've lost the pasuk, 1 second, sinew and flesh, right? And I have given you the ruach, I have given you the spirit, and I have made you alive, and you know that I am Hashem. And then he continues and he talks about the whole idea of they come up, and then I want you to look at pasuk, pasuk Yud Aleph. V'yomer Elai ben Adam, hatzamot ele kol beit Yisrael hema. These are tzamot of all of the Israels. Hema hinei omrim yevashu atzmotenu va'avda tikvatenu. Right? He says the whole of Israel will say, our bones are dried up and we have no tikva. Okay, we have no hope. Nigzarnu lanu. This is our decree. Our decree is that we're done for. Okay, there's nothing left. We've got no hope. Lechen hanaveh amalta, and therefore you need to prophesy and say to them, Kol amar Hashem, hinei ani potech et kvuotachem, veheleti otchem mikvuotachem ami, veheveti otchem el admat Yisrael. And God says to them, prophesy to them and say, I, Hashem, I'm going to open your graves and lift you out your graves, and I'm going to bring you to the land of Israel. V'yadatem ki ani Hashem. See how many times it says, and know that I am God. V'yadatem ki ani Hashem pepitchi et kvrotechem v'holeti otchem mikvrotechem ami. Natati ruchi bachem v'chayitem v'hinachti otchem al admatechem. Okay, and I have given you the spirit, and I have resuscitated you, and I have put you on your land. V'yadatem ki ani Hashem, and know that I am God. Dibalti va'asiti ne'um Hashem. I spoke and I did. I am God. There is something here about, firstly, I mean, I don't know if it was just me, but I feel like this prophecy was like so, it just kept like coming back to me in the last 2 weeks. But I think that there's something very interesting about this, and that is, number one, this idea of tikva, of giving up tikva. What does tikva mean? What does hope mean? And I want to really unpack that now. What does it mean, tikva? What does hope mean? And number two, just to show you that I think that there's something here about the idea of, in every generation, the text speaks to us. We have to just plumb it and mine it for what it has, for what it is, and bring it to this moment. And so I want to begin by speaking about the difference between the contemporary understanding of what hope is and what I'm going to claim to be the biblical understanding. And again, I want to start with a kind of unconventional source. Those of you that know me know that I love the author Matt Haig. And in one of his books, Matt Haig, and the reason why I think Matt Haig speaks to me in such a profound way, specifically related to this course, Matt Haig originally, his first book he wrote is a non-fictional book, and it's called 12 Reasons to Stay Alive. And it's about his journey with depression, with severe depression. And in that book, and it's brilliantly written, he basically goes through his journey and how he was able ultimately, right, to, again, not to beat depression, because I don't know if that even is possible, but to kind of live with depression. And then after that book, he wrote a series of fictional stories. Okay, now I'm not a fictional reader generally, but there's something about these books that are so profound, because even though they're all fictional and they're brilliantly written, every single one of them touches on a theme related to his own experiences. So, for example, he wrote a book called The Humans, which is basically about someone who finds the secret of immortality, and an alien comes down to Earth to get rid of the human that found the secret of immortality. And ultimately, the book is about what does it mean to live as a mortal being, okay? In this book, The Midnight Library, also very similar. The Midnight Library is also a book about a woman who is on the edge of suicide. Okay, she's literally about to commit suicide. Her life is meaningless, worthless, according to how she sees it. And as she's about to, we're not quite sure exactly what happens, but she enters into what's called the Midnight Library, which is a library, an endless, eternal library of obviously millions and millions of books. And every single book is the option of how her life could turn out. And what she does is that the book is about her entering into all the different manifestations of her life, okay? And there's many, many, many lessons in the book, and many life lessons in the book. But I want to just read one one part of the book, because to me, this is like really touches on this idea of what hope is. He says like this, he says, between life and death, there is a library, and within that library, the shelves go on forever. Every book provides a chance to try another life you could have lived, to see how things would be if you had made other choices. Would you have done anything different if you had the chance to undo your regrets? And even if you were a pawn, maybe we all are, then you should remember that a pawn is the most magical piece of all. It might look small and ordinary, but it isn't, because a pawn is never just a pawn. A pawn is a queen in waiting. All you need to do is find a way to keep moving forward, one square after another, and you can get to the other side and unlock all kinds of power. When you stay too long in a place, you forget just how big an expanse the world is. You get no sense of the length of those longitudes and latitudes. Just as she supposed it's hard to have a sense of the vastness inside any one person. But once you sense that vastness, once something reveals itself, hope emerges, whether you want it to or not. And it clings to you as stubbornly as a lichen clings to the rock. That the prison, and you discover that the prison wasn't the place, but the perspective. What's he saying here? He's saying that, and this is one of the questions of any theology, of any religion, but I would say specifically of Judaism, because Judaism, one of the central beliefs in Judaism is that we are free, is that we have free will. And another central belief in Judaism is that there is hashgacha pratit, which means what? There's divine providence, and God knows everything, and everything is meant to be how it's meant to be. And so they are in dialectical opposition. And this is one of the big questions that all of the medieval philosophers grapple with, and plenty of modern philosophers grapple with. How can we have two opposing values, one which lends total freedom to human beings, and one which makes us into a pawn of hashgacha, of God's plan in the world? Which is it? Are we free or are we not? Do we have human agency, or is there divine providence? And what to me is, again, why is this so important to us? It's so important to us because, and we're going to see it in the first story that we're going to enter into in our class after our introductory lessons, is the story of Yosef and his brothers. I promised those last year that we're going to go straight to Sefer Shmot, but we missed the whole Yosef narratives, and we can't miss the Yosef narratives because the Yosef narrative, in my mind, is the story that sits at the heart of how we navigate divine providence and human agency, which, by the way, is also one of those major questions at the heart of facing adversity. If this is my fate, if this is what God wants for me, then maybe I'm just a pawn, and maybe I just need to submit, be subservient, and accept, and not take agency. But the problem is that when I say I'm not a free person, when I say I don't need to take agency of my life, when I say I don't need to act and just let all the circumstances act around me, I become a person who loses hope, tikva, because hope is the way in which I assert my freedom in the world, actively. It's based on the idea of emunah, and faith is always about my relationship to something beyond myself. Think about it. I'm not going to unpack it now. Faith, emunah, is always about my relationship to something beyond myself. Okay? And if that's the case, then emunah means that I'm always moving and becoming in relation to that thing beyond myself. And so I want to go back here to what Matt Haig says here. We can maybe there is a space in which we can be the pawn where we are always able to move towards those unlocked, unimagined potentials and possibilities of the queen in waiting, or whatever we can be. Can I be that pawn? And at the same time, can I be the queen? Can I be in those two places where I'm being acted upon, but I'm also acting upon? Can we be in those two places? And so to my mind, this is at the heart of what tikva is. And this is what he says here. That is hope. When I recognize, right? When I reveal there is something beyond and against. It goes back to what we said at the beginning about these two ways of reading the text. When I realize that there is something beyond the given, when I realize that there is a possibility that can emerge beyond the possibility that I'm seeing in front of me at this moment, when I recognize that there is a dimension that surpasses the dimension of the here and the now, that is where hope is born. That is the arena of hope, okay? And it needs a few things, but one of the most important things is number one, perspective, the way in which I look at my reality, and number two, action. Perspective and action are the two component parts of hope according to the Bible, and I'm going to explain to you in a minute why. I now brought in again another outside source, an external source, not the Torah source, not Torah source. Someone called Rebecca Solnit. Those of you that were at my talk on Hoshana Rabbah, I also brought Rebecca Solnit into her. She has a different, I brought you a different source then. She has a brilliant book that is called Hope in the Dark, Untold History, Wild Possibilities. And there she delineates between the idea of hope as kind of like just hoping and wanting and a very passive stance, and hope as a very active stance. And by the way, her book is, it focuses on the idea of political and social activism. And she goes through many, many different examples in history of where we see this and how we see the difference, how hope, how political activism, social activism, how it's manifested vis-a-vis the idea of hope. Okay, it's a really, really fascinating account, but this is what she says. And I found this, and it's so Jewish. Again, I looked to see, has she got Jewish roots? So I think her father was Jewish. Her mother wasn't, but so much of what she writes is so grounded. And she, by the way, she quotes a lot of Jewish wisdom throughout the book, but it's so grounded in Jewish wisdom. So she says like this, she says, memory produces hope, which again is fascinating, because if we think about the world today, postmodernism is essentially a culture that negates the importance of memory, which is why I believe the postmodern culture we have today is one that is not grounded in the traditional concept of hope at all. Okay, so memory produces hope in the same way amnesia produces despair. The theologian Walter Brueggemann noted, it's an extraordinary statement, one that reminds us that though hope is about the future, grounds for hope lie in the records and recollections of the past. Again, I want to take you back to the hermeneutics. Remember, we're kind of moving between the idea of tikva as a psychological, theological proposition, and the idea of a tikva as a hermeneutical tool. So I want to take you back for a moment to the idea of tikva as a hermeneutical tool. Okay, so she says here that in order to have hope, we have to be cognizant of the past and imaginative vis-a-vis the future. And again, I want to take you back to the hermeneutics of Judaism. Judaism says we have Torah shebichtav. That is the grounding. That is the memory. That is the mandate to look back. But we also have Torah shebichtav, Torah shebe'al peh, which is the dynamic that allows us to imagine future possibilities grounded in the Torah shebichtav. She continues and she says, can we tell of a past that was nothing but defeats and cruelties and injustices, or of a past that was some lovely golden age now irretrievably lost? Or can we tell a more complicated and accurate story, one that has room for the best and the worst, for atrocities and liberations, for grief and jubilation? A memory commensurate to the complexity of the past and the whole cast of participants, a memory that includes our power, produces the forward-directed energy called hope. One of the essential aspects of depression is the sense that you will always be mired in this without without misery, that nothing can and will change. It's what makes suicide so seductive, is the only visible exit from the prison of the present. There's a public equivalent to private depression, a sense that the nation or the society rather than the individual is stuck. And I want to just hold on to this for a minute, because again, when we're talking about our national story and the moment that we're in at this present moment, one, again, buzzword that if you look at many things that people are writing, okay, from Hanoch Dan to Rabbanit Yemima to all the people that are the public voices of Jews, of Israel today, okay? I don't know if you follow these people, it's really, really worth following a lot of these people because a lot of them are speaking out our narrative, okay? I think a lot of what they're saying, and again, this is why I'm going to bring the music in as well, because I think a lot of the musicians, again, are kind of cataloging our narrative in a way that many other people, many supposed leaders are not. And one buzzword from all of these people is the word tikva. I looked back on many of their posts, and you'll see that the word tikva comes up again and again and again. And I think that if we think about how are we going to process this moment in our history, it's exactly what Rebecca Solonit's saying here. It's not by processing it. It's not by saying everything is good. Oh, wow, the Chatufim are home, fantastic, let's celebrate. All of us, and I'm sure there's not one person in the room that won't identify what I'm about to say. Erev Simchat Torah, no one knew what to feel. There was a sense of relief. There was a sense of grief. There was a sense of joy. There was a sense of despair. There was a sense of happiness, and there was a sense of very much sadness. We were oscillating at any given moment. That's why we all came into Simchat Torah totally finished with, as that thing that was going around, with a spoon in our hands, not having cooked anything, right? I don't know if anyone saw this. They was going around in Hebrew, like, can someone please create an amutah that is going to bring food to all of those women that stood with a spoon in their hand opposite the television and didn't get one thing done for right? But like all the time oscillating, and that's what we felt that day. That is our people. But it's also why our people are a people of hope, because we don't lean in necessarily to one narrative or the other. We allow for the complexity, we allow for that above that messiness of all of those things. And this is what she is saying here. When we give up hope is to only lean into the narrative of despair, okay? But then to become inactive is to only lean into the narrative of everything's fine. Because when everything's fine, there's no need for us to take action. So when we are somewhere in the middle, that's when hope is born. So she says, things don't always change for the better, but they change. Okay, I'm going to remind you, becoming. We are always becoming. And so when we change, we can play a role in that change if we act, which is where hope comes in, and memory, the collective memory we call history. This, by the way, this quote, we write history with our feet. What time am I meant to finish?
You're supposed to start it.
I'm meant to finish now? I'm so confused with the timing. You're staying with me till Ashra tells me. Okay, so we write history with our feet is what, remember, Avram Yeshua Heschel.
9:55, you're supposed to start the Hebrew here.
Okay, so I've got to finish. So Avram Yeshua Heschel spoke about praying with his feet when he went and he marched with Martin Luther King. She's for sure taken it from there. She says, we hope with our feet. I'm going to finish there. We hope with our feet. Next time we're going to come back, I'm going to try and understand how we hope with our feet. What does it mean to hope with our feet? And how is it connected to the idea of hermeneutics of our biblical text? So I will see you all next week. Till 9:50. No. What? Oh, you're so sweet. No, I'm good. Thank you so much. Bye. Right.